welcome. Thank you all for coming on Mr. Cantatori. So we're going to have a short presentation with Operation Wallacea this summer. In June, we're going to try to get a trip organized to Peru. We've been with them twice already, once in Honduras 2 years ago, and this past summer to Dominica. We've taken 5 students on the first trip and then 4 students on the second trip to Dominica. So we're hoping to get a good group this year to go to Peru. And you'll hear all about what they're going to be doing there. We do have one student who went on both trips, and she'll just say a few words about her experiences, and then we'll get to the presentation.
Me talk now?
Yeah.
Should I? Go up. Okay.
Show off that shirt that you got in Honduras.
Yeah, this is the Honduras shirt. It's super fun. You learn a lot. It's definitely stuff you wouldn't be able to do until your undergrad years or just master's year. And then if you're really into bio, you learn like what specialties you want to do. So like you could go to ornithology, work with birds, do herpetology, work with reptiles and amphibians. But if you don't want to be a bio major, you still learn so much stuff that you would never know. And it's an amazing experience. Recommend going on it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Scott from Operation Wallacea.
Cool. Well, I can't. I never like to follow up from students because that's sort of the best person to tell you guys about what it's actually like. So I appreciate you saying kind of what your experience was. So yeah, my name is Scott Sveiven. I am the U.S. Director of Operation Wallacea, so I head up our office in Virginia. Just kind of give you guys a little background so you kind of know where I'm coming from, a little bit about the organization. So I did an undergrad in biology. I did a program pretty similar to what we run in Kenya when I was a junior, going out, helping to do research, interacting with sort of like a wildlife immersion program, pretty influential in my career. I took some time off between undergrad and grad and did a bunch of travel and some random jobs and ended up working at a toothbrush factory for a while at Sam Adams. And then I went back to grad school and did conservation biology. And I did a master's with the Park Service, doing some research out in the Rockies looking at wetland plants. And then I was teaching at a forestry college. Come on, we're just getting started. Oh, or not, before coming to work for these guys. So my background is really science research, science education, and one of the things I liked about Operation Wallacea was that it's sort of a combination of the two. One other aspect I should mention that just sometimes I forget because I go out and give these presentations all the time. So we are a relatively small organization in the US. We're headquartered and we're founded in England. So we have a pretty strong British influence in terms of the staff out on a lot of the sites. So Charlotte, right, is kind of my UK counterpart. So a lot of our staff are still headquartered in the UK, but we now have groups that come out from all over the world. So the US office is the second biggest, but we have school groups that come out from Japan, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, all over Europe. And that's one of the elements that I also think is really neat about this is we put together teams of researchers and students, and they're coming from all over the place. We had about somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 students, high school and university total, this past summer come through our various programs. All right, so I'm going to start with just a little background so you guys kind of understand sort of our organization before I delve right into Peru. So we take our namesake, which is a pretty obscure reference, to be honest. Sometimes I wish we would change our name because it doesn't really mean all that much to most people. After Alfred Russel Wallace. Anybody here heard of Wallace? No. Good, Mr. Candator. All right, cool. One person. All right, so Alfred Russel Wallace, he's kind of a forgotten figure in the field of biology and in the field of natural science. In many ways, he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. Right? He was a little bit younger. Unlike Darwin, he did not come from a background of money. But he was a very keen observer of sort of the natural world, had a lot of interest in it. So he dropped out of school when he was 14. He set sail with his friend Henry Walter Bates down here to the Rio Negro region of the Amazon. This was 1848 to 1852. They spent 4 years collecting specimens. All right? And his plan was to ship those specimens back to England where they were going to be sold to museums, private collectors. Pretty common practice at this time. Now, unfortunately for Wallace, after spending 4 years down this pretty remote area in the Amazon. He was sailing back to England, and right here, his ship caught fire, sank, lost most of his valuable specimens, most of his journals. Actually pretty lucky to be alive. They were lost at sea for the better part of 10 days in lifeboats before pretty miraculously being rescued by a passing freight ship. All right, so he did eventually make it back to England. I don't know about you, if I'd spent 5 years doing that and my ship sank, I would probably look for a different ship, a different career, right? All right, but that's not what Wallace did. He was determined. He regrouped a few years later, came down here to the Malay Archipelago, which is where his most influential and important work took place. Now, there's some interesting aspects of these islands down here. What Wallace was looking at is not just what he found, but where he found it. And you notice some really striking patterns. So right here, for example, if you go from Sulawesi over to Borneo, or Bali over to Sumatra, you have a big turnover in species. Right? There's very little overlap between the two. And what he suggested is there's got to be some explanation for this. So he proposed a barrier, in this case a deep oceanic trench, right here where this dotted line is. And this indeed turned out to be correct. It's called Wallace's Line. And what it meant is that during ice ages, when a lot of water gets locked up as ice, sea level drops, and so animals can spread between these islands, but only as far as this line, which is why you get tigers as far south as Bali, but not any further. All right? And conversely, on this other side, there's another trench, which is why you get tree kangaroos up here in Papua New Guinea. But this bit of islands in the middle here is sometimes called the Wallacea region. All right? So up to 90% of the animals there are unique to that region. It's very similar to Madagascar in that way. All right? There's no large mammals. Anybody know what filled the top predator slots? We want to wager a guess. Usually people are a little reluctant. That's okay, I understand.
In this area?
Yeah, in this area.
Oh, sloth.
Not mammals.
Not mammals. Sharks.
Oh, that's a good guess. So on the islands. There are a lot of sharks there. That is true. Land sharks are terrifying. All right, so it was reptiles. All right, so most famously the Komodo dragon, right? The largest lizard in the world comes from a couple small islands in this region, right around here, and also the world's longest snakes live in this region. Now, Wallace did a couple things here. In addition to noticing this pattern, he sort of launched a field called biogeography, which is the study of the geographical distribution of organisms and sort of why they exist where they do. So, for example, why is Australia dominated by marsupials when they're nearly absent from most other continents? Right? We have one native marsupial here, right, and the possum. Right? Whereas here, most of the large mammals are marsupials. So it's a field in and of itself. He had one other important contribution, which is where he really got forgotten. He came down with malaria, not the luckiest guy, and he was kind of in a fever in this small village called Sarawak, and he had this idea that helped explain, in his mind, some of the observations he was making. And so he wrote this idea up, he sent it off to England to some mutual friends of his and Charles Darwin, some influential thinkers at the time, and it eventually ended up in the hands of Darwin, who's said to have gone, oh my God, that's it. This guy's beat me to my life's work. All right, now Darwin had been thinking about his ideas for a long time, hadn't written them up, hadn't published them. All right, now effectively what Wallace came up with was the same idea, evolution via natural selection. All right, so that is what prompted, when it was first presented to the Royal Academy, the Linnean Society in London, it was initially introduced as Mr. Darwin and Mr. Wallace's theory. Right? Now, a couple years later, 1858, Charles Darwin publishes his book on the origin of species. That's where most of sort of the controversy came in. That's where a lot of the public debate came in, and Wallace was largely forgotten. Right? So, Wallacea region right here, that was our first project in 1995. That is why we are called Operation Wallacea. It really doesn't tell you much about what we do. It's a pretty obscure geographical reference, even for biology nerds, but that is why we're called Operation Wallacea. Now, since then, we've grown a lot. So we're now working in 14 countries around the world, and that's sort of why we're called Operation Wallacea, but I didn't really tell you what we are. So effectively, what we are is a network of academics. All right? So these are people from around the world, in some cases universities, in some cases museums, in some cases just biologists that come out and do research on these projects. So they're participating in more than 120 projects across our sites. And if you're an academic, your goal in general, if you're in the field of science, the way you're going to advance your career is to publish. So their goal is to publish in their sort of respective peer-reviewed journals. Now, to give you a flavor for how these teams are put together. The last 3 years, I've managed our project in Guyana. It's one of our smallest, most remote sites in northern South America. It tends to be a pretty diverse crew. So my herpetologist the last few years, she came out in 2014 as a student volunteer, then as a junior staff, and then the last 2 years as sort of a co-lead. I had a guy who was doing his PhD work through the University of Florida. He was running what was the largest camera trapping project in the world, looking at jaguar distribution across the country and other large mammals. And then a bird scientist came from the museum in North Carolina. He is like the expert on birds of the Guyana Shield. And my bat scientist, probably my favorite example, the kind of people you may get involved with. I describe him as like the Indiana Jones of bats, all right? This guy is, he goes around the world, studies bats. He's described 8 new species from the forest in Guyana alone. He's a real expert in mammals, but he's actually a curator at the Royal Museum of Ontario. So those are the kind of people that we get involved with. Some of the outputs that come from these surveys over time, we've described over 35 vertebrate species new to science. There's a lot more in the works. A lot of those come from the Wallacea project. Temporal and spatial data sets, I'll kind of explain what that means, but basically we're looking at things over time and over distances. And we can sort of use these to assess how well any sort of management strategies in these sites, say in the Pacaya Simulator Reserve, where the Peru project is located, are working. Now this is important because this is a little bit different model of doing scientific research, and it has some advantages. Normally, if you're one of the researchers I just mentioned, what you're going to do is you're going to go out, you're going to apply for funding, and you're going to hopefully get funded, go to your work for a few years, right? Problem is, after those 3 or 4 years, you can reapply for funding, but very often you're not going to get it, right? And that's the end of your project. So if you look through the literature of ecological studies, biological studies, they're full of these 3 or 4 year projects that then have to end. All right, so it doesn't really allow you to look at things long term and assess how things are changing over time, which is part of what we're interested in. So the Opwall model is quite a different way to fund science. All right, so what we do is we go out and we involve students, high school groups, and university students from around the world, and it's actually the fees that they pay to come participate in these programs that funds all of the research. So when we say conservation research through academic partnerships, it's quite literal. Our research projects wouldn't exist if we didn't bring out students. There'd be no reason for students to be interested in coming out on one of our projects if we weren't doing research, right? That's what makes us unique. It's sort of that two-way street, right? But the key part of that is it's more sustainable. It allows us to go back year after year after year and build up some really long-term data sets. So I mentioned our Wallacea project, our first project in Indonesia. That project is going to be going to its 24th field season, by far the longest running project of its kind anywhere in that part of the world. Right? So there's some really valuable outputs. One of the other things, in addition to sort of the time scale, is we can do some really interesting comparisons between sites because we do similar survey methods at multiple sites. All right? So this is an example of looking at frog species from our neotropical sites, and actually was first noticed at our Peru project. Now, what the team there found is when they were going out and doing these surveys, they were doing them at night and during the day. And what they tended to find is if they went out at night, they tended to find large frogs, large species, but also large examples of smaller species. And if they went out at day, they tended to find small frogs, right? Smaller species, smaller individuals. So what they hypothesized, what they suggested, is that there must be something driving this pattern. They sort of posited that if you were a large frog, you were trying to stay out of the way of active daytime predators, things like shorebirds that would find you very conspicuous, easy to pick off. Right? Whereas if you were a small frog, you're actually trying to stay out of the way of the large frogs. So you tended to operate during the day, you could hide, you could be a little bit more cryptic, avoid some of those predators during the daytime. Right? So that's what they thought. What was really useful about this is that we were able to compare that from the data from our other projects and see if that pattern held up. And indeed it did, right? So this was the first time this had really been noticed, and it would not have been possible if we didn't do these types of surveys at multiple sites in the neotropics. All right, now that's just one example. One of the things that is a primary output of our research, like I said, is the publications coming out from the academics. We've passed 300 now, and that's with these approximately 8-week field seasons every summer. So it's a pretty short period of time to go out and collect data. Key point being there is a direct scientific output that we're accomplishing from this. One of the other aspects of our model that I should mention, this is certainly true in Peru. if you ever study conservation from an international perspective, one of the things you'll learn is that it doesn't work in general like it does here in the US. You can't just say, this is Yosemite National Park, or this area is going to be managed for the wildlife in it, we're not going to have people live there. It generally doesn't work that way, right? These are where people live. So in the case of the Pacaya-Samira Reserve, the Koga Indians have been living in there long before it was ever set aside as a protected area. So they're key partners in our work and how that resource is being managed. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. All right? But so we actively partner with communities in all the places we work, and we give them an incentive to sort of approach conservation, right? So there are oftentimes the guides, the local staff, the cooks, and sometimes, in some cases, the researchers, and we put money into these projects, right? That's how we run them every summer. So this was in 2015, so this has actually gone up over the last 2 years. We put over $3 million into all of our projects around the world, right? So that gives them some incentive. All right, so that's some background on our organization, who we are, what we do. I want to talk specifically about our Peru project in the Amazon. So this is what it looks like when you're flying to Iquitos. Basically forest as far as the eye can see. It's pretty fantastic. Now Iquitos itself is a pretty interesting city. It's the largest city by population in the world that you cannot reach by road. All right? You cannot drive here. So you can get here by plane or you can get here by boat. All right? It's quite a thriving metropolis. It's probably best known, well, I guess within the country. It's got a real sense of faded wealth. Faded glory. Does anybody know what drove the wealth of this region? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
Gold.
It's a good guess. No, it wasn't gold. Another good guess. No, it's not. It wasn't mine. It comes from trees. I'll give you a hint.
Rubber.
Rubber. Yeah, rubber. Yep. So back at the turn of the century, this was an early exporter of rubber, and the native range of rubber trees before they were exported around the world or stolen out of Peru, depending on how you look at it, it had to come generally from the upper reaches of the Amazon. Right? And this was, of course, really important in the early 1900s when you had automobiles and a lot of industrial applications. So at one point in time, this area was one of the wealthiest in the world. There was a lot of wealth. So there's like old opera houses and old mansions and all kinds of old stuff in Iquitos. Now, I mentioned those seeds were taken out of Peru. They established rubber plantations in Sri Lanka and Indonesia and other parts of around the world, and then eventually everybody lost out because they developed synthetic rubber. All right? So that industry's gone. But the rubber barons, in addition to sort of extracting the rubber, they found this place so lovely that they built this pretty large metropolitan city here. This is going to be your kind of first view, and you can see we're pretty far inland, and you still can barely see sort of the far bank of the Amazon River just in town in Iquitos. All right. Now you're going to spend the night there at a place called Casa Mores, where we usually put people up. It's actually a refurbished mansion from a rubber baron, from Louis Mores, so that's a pretty neat experience. It's not really open to the public. So you can spend a night there, and then you're going to take a 2-hour bus ride to a place called Nauta, and that's where you're going to get on the research ships. Now it's a pretty long ways upriver, and we're going upriver, and these are pretty old boats. So a lot of them were built during the heyday of the rubber boom, and they're actually been refurbished now as research ships. So that's where you're going to be staying. Those are your accommodations. That's going to leave you a couple-day journey. This is a good example. This is the Rio Amazonas. This is the big one. This is what you guys are going to be staying on. Pretty unique aspect of the experience, right? This is, I think, our only project where people stay on ships the whole time. Means you've got some creature comforts relative to some of our other sites, depending on how you view it. So there's sort of bunks, so you're going to have a bed. There's a fan. They run the generator on the boat. So compared to, say, Guyana, the project I run, where you sleep in hammocks out in the middle of the rainforest, this is pretty luxurious, pretty comfortable. All right? Now, while you're going upriver to the Pacaya-Samira Reserve, we're going to be putting you through an Amazonian wildlife and ecology course. This was developed, and actually the boats themselves are owned by our key partner in this. His name is Dr. Richard Bodmer. He's a lecturer at the University of Kent. He's been working down in the Amazon for a long time. So if you ever look up things about sort of biological publications, experts in the Amazon, you will certainly come across his name. He's been doing work here for a long time. So he basically is our key partner, sort of the person who started our Peru project. Right? But you can see basically it's going to be a primer course getting you ready for the surveys we're doing, kind of immerse you in some of the unique ecology and aspects of this environment on your way up, so that you're ready to hit the ground running when you get up into the Buckeye-Smear Reserve. Now, the Buckeye-Smear Reserve, you can see it's bordered by two rivers, so where they join here is kind of where Amazon proper starts, the Buckeye and the Smear River. This area in between is massive. Come on in. And it's a pretty fascinating place to work. Tourism in general is not allowed here, so we're allowed to bring our groups up because we're doing research. Right? So it's not the kind of place people can really access on their own. There's these red dots here, the Wakama Indians that I mentioned, and you can see there's a few of them toward the entrance of the park, but the further up you go, it gets pretty remote upper reaches of the Amazon. Now, one of the things you'll notice about this landscape is it's a very, very dynamic environment, right? And that's driven by flooding. So we're just talking about the eastern flanks of the Andes, the upper headwaters of the Amazon River, right? So when the seasonal rains come, wash down off the Andes, also snowmelt, you're going to get these pretty dramatic shifts in the hydrology. And that's going to be really important for some of the surveys we're doing, for some of the biology we're looking at, to the point where, on average, this forest might flood by about 30 feet a year, all right, in terms of high point, low point, 10 meters of water. And that's going to have some really interesting implications as that pattern has become more erratic in recent years. So this, of all our projects, has some pretty strong links to changes in climatic variables, in particular rain. All right? So we've seen extreme droughts and we've seen extreme flooding, and that has a big impact when you're talking about a forest that's almost entirely flooded. Right? So those are part of the underpinnings of the biodiversity surveys you guys are going to be rotating through. One of those is terrestrial mammals. There's over 100 species of mammals in this reserve. Now, let me tell you a little bit more background of why these surveys are important. I mentioned how flooded the forest gets. Average flooding year, the forest in terms of actual area that's not flooded shrinks down to 5% of the total land area, 5%. So you can imagine you've got all these mammals crammed into this small area, right? Now, if you're a capybara, these are aquatic, these are the world's largest rodents, right? They can handle some water, but what else is crammed down into that small area? The predators, right? Okay, so if you have an increased flooding event, instead of 5% of the land, they might have 3%. So this is part of why this dynamic is really important and why we're really looking closely at these populations. All right, so to do this, you're going to do it a couple ways. One of them is terrestrial transfer. You guys just get an idea of this flooding if you look at the stilt roots on this tree. Right? I'm a tree nerd. I used to teach trees at this forestry college, though. Forestry's kind of my thing. But you can imagine the base of the trunk of the tree is way up here to give you an idea of the level of flooding and some of the adaptations that the species have. So going on and doing the transects, it's something called distance sampling. So effectively with distance sampling, what you're doing is you're walking a transect, a survey line, and the idea is as you're walking this, if you have an animal right on your transect, you're going to see it, unless you're being really incompetent or having a horrible day or looking up at the sky or whatever. If there's a capybara on your transect, you're going to see it. Your probability of detecting it is 100%. Right? But if that animal, that capybara or tapir or jaguar or whatever it is say a kilometer off your transect in the forest, your probability of detecting it is going to be pretty low. Right? So you could plot this, right? You could plot the probability of detection, right? Like a curve, like a bell curve. The idea is you're using that probability of detection and what you actually find in terms of what you encounter on the transect to work out or estimate the abundance of these species, right? So this is a pretty common method in a lot of our sites. It's pretty well established in the scientific literature. It's a pretty good way to estimate mammal abundance, basically just using linear distance from your transect and the counts of what you see. Now the problem with that is there's some animals that you're just not very likely to see. Right? There's a lot of, this is true of my Guyana project, the one I managed last year, is very similar to the Peru project. So there's a lot of jaguars in this reserve, a lot of ocelots, a lot of tapirs, a lot of other large mammals. They're pretty good at not being seen. And a group of people walking through the forest are pretty bad at not being seen, right? So to actually come across these guys in the forest is pretty tough to do because they survive by avoiding detection, right? So what we do is we set up camera traps, effectively remote controlled the cameras, same thing as game cams, trail cams. You guys see these around actually the area here. They're looking at mountain lion populations with these camera traps, right? So this is one way to supplement the data of the transects and to try to figure out something about the animals that you're a little less likely to see is by strategically placing camera traps. All right, this is then something called patch occupancy sampling. Different methodology. Basically, you're trying to figure out a percentage of an area where you can find signs through camera traps or also scat and tracks of jaguars. You can figure out an estimate of their population based on how much of the area you find them in, if that makes sense. All right, now this is going to be important because, like I said, we're looking at a couple different things. So we're looking at how these populations change over time and how they change in relation to flooding events. So I mentioned 2009, it was a drought year. 2010, 2011 were high flood years. You can see our population estimates of white-lipped peccaries went way down in those extreme flood years. Right? And that's valuable because the Kokama Indians are hunting these guys. So again, this is a real output of the data students help us collect, is setting sustainable yields for hunting quotas for these guys. Right? So this is a subsistence thing. I won't get too far into it, but basically the idea behind this is the carrying capacity is K, so how many peccaries could an environment support, could the Pacaya Scenario Reserve support? And what you're looking at is down here, if their population was very low, your rate of growth, which is what this curve plots as the rate of growth, right? So if you have very few individuals, your rate of growth is going to be high, they're going to breed, all of those individuals are going to be able to move, find food, and survive. As you get closer to the carrying capacity or the maximum amount that reserve can support, your rate of growth is going to decline. They're still going to be breeding, but those juveniles aren't going to survive. There's not enough food, not enough resources. All right, so this is classic population ecology. Well, you use those numbers and those population estimates to work out what you think the sustainable yield or the maximum harvest is at sort of this peak. So this is one management tool that comes out of these data. All right, another survey you're going to be involved in is looking at the primates. This is a fantastic site for primates. There's 12 species that live in the reserve, and they, they're not going to be impacted as much by flooding, right? Because most of these guys can be up in the trees. They're going to be generally not finding food on the ground. It's kind of part of their survival strategy. One of the interesting things in terms of looking at the primates is the wide variety of niches they occupy or roles they play in the environment. So in some cases, like the mother says, they might eat tree exudates, so sap and gum from trees. Some are going to eat fruits, some are just going to eat leaves, some are going to eat insects, some are mixed feeders, they're opportunistic, right? So they have different roles that they play. A kind of an interesting backstory, I'm going to try to make these as interesting science talks as I can so you guys don't get too bored. So the capuchins here. A lot of places capuchins will basically use a rock to crack these really hard nuts. It's part of their diet, right? But they don't do that here. And the reason they don't do that here is because they can't find any rocks, right? There are no rocks that are easily accessible in this part of the Amazon. It's a pretty interesting story why that is, right? So long time ago, 15 million years ago, the Amazon River actually flowed out into the Pacific. All right? So it flowed the opposite direction that it does now. But as the South American plate and the Pacific plate began to collide, Andes Mountains rose, it basically cut off the flow of the Amazon. All right? Now, for a long time, what that meant is it created a very large inland sea in South America. And so over time, sediment deposited at the bottom of this lake, and you have to dig down several feet in any part of this reserve to find any sort of bedrock or rocks. All right? Now, eventually, over time, a channel broke out on the other side, and the lake drained out to the Atlantic, which is the way the Amazon flows now. Right? Interesting geologic history of the Amazon basin. And I'll tie into a few other species I'll mention as well, so kind of keep that one in mind. But so the capuchins in this site, what they've done is they've learned to use a harder type of nut to crack a softer type of nut. So they actually use a different type of nut to crack another nut. All right, so another survey you're going to be doing, besides the primates, habitat surveys. These are really important. We do a lot of sort of outputs with the habitat data. So one of the things we're interested in is estimating the amount of carbon in this forest, right? There's a lot of reasons for that. I won't get into them. They're kind of complicated, but there's some trading schemes that exist that can help reserves like this get credits financially for not cutting down the forest, basically carbon trading schemes on the international market. Now, in order to do that, though, you need to know the standing biomass or volume of your trees estimated in your forest. Right? We do this in a lot of our projects. That's only one side of it, though, and the Peruvian government has actually used the data from this project for that purpose, which is pretty cool from my side of it, all the way up to the top level of the government there. The other aspect, though, habitat is the biological template which all of these other groups are interacting with, right? So if you want to know something about the distribution of your bird species, your primate species, you need to know something about the habitat and their association with it, right? So do they prefer areas with denser canopies, with larger trees, with smaller trees, with certain types of trees, right? So that's one of the other reasons we survey habitat, is that it correlates to all of the other taxa, animal taxa we're looking at. All right, another one of the surveys you're going to be doing is mist netting for birds. A lot of our sites will also do what's called point counts, but to be honest, the bird community in this area is incredibly diverse. 600 species or so of bird in this forest, if not even more. So instead what we're going to do is mist netting. For the mist net, you basically have a 3 meter tall, 10-foot net. It's got these fine sort of black mesh shelves. Birds can't see it, they're flying through the forest, they're going to fly in these nets and they're going to get caught. Key advantage there, you're going to be able to remove the birds with the help of the ornithologist. You're going to be able to identify the species. You can look at whether or not it's got a brood patch. You can put a band on it. You can weigh it. You can do a lot of things. What's the limitation of this study, though?
You have to release.
You have to release them, yeah. Well, yeah, you're going to release them. Yeah.
You're only going to get smaller birds because birds of prey won't fly into them unless you get lucky.
Unless you guys catch a hawk, right? I heard, yeah. Yeah, you're going to get smaller birds. So you're going to miss some birds, larger birds of prey, also ground birds, right? Ones that walk, those aren't that likely to get stuck in these. The other thing is this is only 10 feet tall, right? How tall is the rainforest canopy down here? Yeah, it's a lot taller than 10, right? 100 plus feet tall. So a lot of the stuff that's in the canopy, you're going to miss, right? So one of the trade-offs of this method, and one of the things we're doing at some of our other sites like Guyana, is we actually use sound recorders and go out and try to identify birds higher up by their calls. But that, of course, is pretty difficult. You need a pretty expert ornithologist to be able to ID that. Either way, though, you're gonna find a lot of really interesting birds in the mist nets. And one of the other things going on here, just like the primates I mentioned, is sort of the diverse roles they've taken. So you guys can kind of gather some of that just by looking at these beaks. Everything from the toucan here, most famously, of course. This is a hollow beak, right? If it wasn't, this bird wouldn't be able to fly. It would just immediately crash to the ground. It's a really hard-keeled beak, so it's really good at cracking open large fruits. This is a motmot, sort of good at picking off insects. Of course, hummingbirds, kingfishers. So these guys are going to spear fish, right? So it's kind of got a spear-shaped bill. Wood creepers for prying open little cracks in trees and picking out grubs. And these mannequins, you guys will absolutely love these mannequins. They're pretty well known for some of their courtship displays. So a lot of people think Michael Jackson invented the moon dance, but the red cap mannequin, actually, you guys should check it out. I don't have a video of it on here, but that's part of their mating behavior, is the males will actually do like this really cool moon dance. And apparently female mannequins love it. So that's another surveys you're going to be doing. We're also looking at macaws as indicator species. So this is a little bit different. This is actually going out usually in boats and actually doing point counts. So basically you're going to go out to a point on the river, you're going to sit there for 10 minutes and you're going to record all of the macaws that you can see or hear. Has anybody here heard a macaw before? Okay, beautiful birds, they sound like idiots. They have the most ridiculous, annoying call, but they're really easy to pick out. It's like this really loud squawk, like there's a lot of them in the project I work at. Very distinctive. So they're very good indicators of changes in forest because number one, they're going around and eating fruit, but number two, they're pretty sensitive to disturbance. And they've also been subject to a lot of exploitation for the pet trade. All right, so it's a good one to monitor. It can tell you a lot about what's going on in an environment. So this is one of the sort of special surveys you guys are going to be doing. Another one of those is the river dolphins. All right, so river dolphins are also pretty sensitive to disturbance. Number one, they're going to be, pretty freely able to move within this flooded forest system, within the river system. So if there's a lot of activity, or if there's a lot of fishing, or if there's a lot of disturbance, they'll just move out. So having river dolphins in an area means that they're not being harassed and they also can tell you a lot about the river. Now, interesting story, there's 2 species of river dolphins. Anybody know this one by chance? This is the pink river dolphin. All right, so there's 2 species. The pink river dolphin, now the idea goes, I mentioned that, that large lake that formed, that inland sea. The idea is that these guys got trapped there. And as a result, they sort of went off in their own direction in terms of their adaptations. Their behavior is very different than the gray river dolphins. These guys are very similar to what you'd find out in the ocean. So the pink river dolphins, they have the most highly developed sonar of the cetaceans, at least among the most highly developed. They actually stun their prey with a blast of sonar. You guys ever seen this on these nature shows? They're specialists at moving into the flooded forest in between tree roots. They're very nimble. They're the only dolphin that can turn its head from side to side. They're pretty different than most dolphins. Whereas the gray dolphins, the idea is that once the Amazon started flowing out to the Atlantic, these guys swam up. Like I said, they're pretty similar to what you find. So their behavior is really different. These guys will jump out of the water. With these, you're lucky if you see them do that. So we're looking at both species. That's another survey you're going to be involved in. Another one is fish, kind of tied to this. So we're gonna put out gill nets where we can catch the fish, and we're looking at things you'd expect. There's hundreds of species of fish in these systems. Really, really diverse in terms of fish. But part of the reason we're interested in this is for the management, right? Again, the Kokama Indians harvest these fish as part of their livelihood, part of their sustenance. So for us to have an idea of what those important fish stocks are doing is really helpful to management. So in 2009, I mentioned that was a pretty good year in terms of a pretty average year. And you can see a lot of large males. That's basically what this is, right? So the count and also the length. So a lot of large individuals. Then I mentioned we had a drought between 2009 and 2010 and 11, and you can see there's a shift toward more younger fish. And this is also when we had more flooding. So you had more young fish being caught, a different distribution of size, right? So that is useful to know if you want to figure out how to manage or try to set quotas for these fish. There's a lot of surveys to do on this project because there's no marine site. So it's probably our largest set of science surveys in our neotropical sites. Another one we're working on is caiman. All right, 3 species of caiman here: black caiman, spectacled caiman, and smooth-fronted. Smooth-fronted is the smallest, but the black and the spectacled were both hunted pretty heavily for their hides, for handbags and shoes and suitcases and things like this. Well, after being pretty lowered in their populations being pretty reduced, the management of the park has sort of put a moratorium on hunting them, and so we're kind of watching the recovery, and they certainly are recovering. So the black caiman, pretty large, and the spectacles a little bit smaller. So we're going to be going out, we're going to be doing surveys, looking at when these guys, you can find their eyes shine pretty easily at night, and when possible, the team will sometimes try to catch them. Bring them on the boat. Not the really big ones, of course. They're strong. I mean, they're really strong animals. But they're doing that so that they can take some biometric data. So take some tissue samples, record more specifically their weight, some aspects of their health, their age, things like this. Right? So that's another one of the surveys. Oh, and then sometimes they'll actually put a tube in their mouth and regurgitate so we can see what they've been eating. Another one of the surveys that is going on down there is amphibians. Fantastic part of the world in terms of diversity for amphibians. There's a lot of frog surveys. So these are going to be, a lot of this is going to be done by going out at night. And one of the specific aspects that we're looking at with our frog surveys there is the importance of these floating vegetation mats. So along the river, you see these big mats of water hyacinth. And those are really important breeding grounds for a lot of frogs, right? They provide some protection from predators. They can lay their eggs, can hatch into tadpoles that can sort of associate with this vegetation. So we're doing some special work to try to go look at the role of those vegetation mats in frog reproduction. All right, there's a handful of other surveys that just kind of depend a little bit on the seasonality, the conditions on site. One of those is looking at wading birds and shorebirds, which will come in depending on water levels. Also turtles. So as the water drops toward the end, some of you guys are going to be there kind of at the end of the dry season, at least generally that's the pattern you'd expect. And those riverbanks start to be exposed, turtles are going to come up. Kind of a similar story to the caiman. So there's 3 species there. A couple of them, the giant Amazonian river turtle and also the yellow-spotted turtle, had been pretty reduced in terms of their population. They were hunted. So what the management has done is basically gone out and collected those eggs, started to rear them as young, and then re-release them. So that's part of what we're helping them to monitor. All right, there's also some other surveys. Fishing bats is a really cool one. So going out at night and using like a little sonar detector to try to figure out the fishing bats. They're pretty unique in terms of they basically fly around at night, use their sonar, and catch fish right out of the river. And also a butterfly survey that I don't have slides on. So as you can see, you'll be doing a lot of stuff. You'll be busy. You'll be working through a lot of different surveys and helping us collect a wide variety of data on this environment. Either way, the Cayuga Community Reserve is an absolutely amazing place to work, to be, to experience. And one of the aspects that I mentioned here is the Kokama Indians that live in sort of small villages around here. So on your way out of the trip, you're going to stop into one of these villages. They are extremely friendly and like to basically have a big welcome party when we go there with students. And so you can interact with them, stop and see how they live in this environment and how they use the forest and the river. All right. So you guys might have noticed there's a few elements to this that usually parents want to ask questions about or want to think about the health and safety. Usually students aren't so worried about it. So as an organization, like I said, we brought about 3,500 people last year. If we did do a good job with health and safety, we would not be around very long, right? And this is basically our 7-point health and safety plan. So I'll run through it real briefly. But all of this information is also on our website specifically for the Peru project. So if you guys want to look at any of the health and safety information in more detail, I would encourage you to do that. It's available for all of our projects. All right, so first part of this, training of students in safety procedures. What that means is that on all of our projects, before we send anyone out into the forest or really even let them get out of camp, we're going to go through health and safety. What is unique about this environment? What things do you have to be thinking about, being proactive about to make sure you stay safe? Because again, it's not just your safety. What you're doing might impact your fellow students, it might impact the staff. So making sure everyone's on the same page about where we are, what we're doing, and how to stay safe is kind of a prerequisite before we send anyone out in the forest. Part of this is risk assessments. So like I said, these, I don't know if anybody ever aside from us, reads them. They're possibly, the world's most boring documents. They're like 40-page rubrics, effectively, of everything you're going to be doing, what could happen, how we would respond to it. All right. So the idea is that we've gone through, and to the extent that's possible, identified and mitigated, or at least addressed every single risk. So this includes everything from, obvious stuff like life jackets in boats to really simple stuff. Like tripping and falling when you're walking in the forest. All right, so those are the risk assessments. Medical cover, this takes 2 forms at most of our projects. So number 1, everybody that comes out on one of our expeditions is covered by our insurance. All right, so it's a $1.5 million plan per person. We do that for a couple reasons. Number 1, we can. Our insurers know our safety record, so we get pretty good deals to insure everyone. The second reason is we used to have people get their own, and to be honest, it just was kind of garbage. Like, we had a student from the U.S., of course, on our Honduras project, and she went into anaphylactic shock. All right, so it wasn't life-threatening. They had stabilized her, but the medics on site wanted to send her down to the hospital for further treatment. And so they rang up her insurance company and said, all right, here's the situation, here's what we want to do, how do you guys want us to approve this? And they said, okay, we'll look into it and we'll figure it out, we'll talk to you in the morning. And when they talked to him the next morning, they said, okay, where is Honduras? Like, not where are you in Honduras, but like, where is Honduras as a country? And so that's the other reason that we provide insurance for everybody coming out. So we already have these plans in place, agreed to. If we need to evacuate someone or if we need to do something, it's already set up. The other side of this is having a medic. So the Peru project would have a medic on site. These are usually Western doctors. Sometimes they're characters themselves. My last 2 years, I've had this Scottish medic, and then I have pretty good friends at this point. He's really good with the students. So there's medical cover in that sense as well. A doctor or a medical nurse basically out on these projects. Communications. Obviously, it's really important to have an open line of communication. On the Kissimmee Reserve, that's going to mean a satellite phone, and then also two-way radios between the survey teams and the boat when they're out doing the surveys close there. Right? Emergency evacuation plans, again, you guys can look these up on our website, basically how we would respond to different categories of injury or emergency. But the key point, again, is that those are already in place and updated every year before we start the project. So if, for example, we needed to organize a float plane into the Amazon, we know exactly who we're going to call, and they're going to come out, and they know where we're going to be. Right? BS 8848 compliant. That is kind of some alphabet soup to you guys, doesn't mean much, but it's a British standard for expedition safety. What that means is that we get audited every year about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And to be honest, they often use us as an example for other organizations that are bringing students out, right? So it's a pretty thorough auditing process. And the last aspect of this is that we publish the medical statistics every year from what happens. So you guys can look at basically a summary of the injuries from the Peru project or any project you want. We make that pretty open and transparent. Coursework and university entry. I won't spend too much time talking about this, with a few exceptions. So one of the really exciting things that we have going is Shasta College up in Reading. They're pretty huge supporters of the organization. They bring a group of about 25 or 30 out every year. They've created a course available to all high school students for 3 college credits. That has actually been in place for a while, but what's really exciting is they've negotiated with their administration to effectively have it be tuition free. So it costs like $31.50 or something, and you can get 3 college credits. A little bit of pre-departure reading and activities, and a little bit of post-departure reflection, and there's a few bits and pieces that you do for the course. But so that is an option. The other thing, I mean, this is a pretty unique opportunity to go out and actually work with researchers, you know, in this case in the Amazon. So that definitely gives you something to talk about as you're applying for jobs or thinking about college. Just the experience itself is the part that I usually think you can get the most mileage out of. Like I said, something like this was pretty influential in my career. So, all right, fundraising support. This is something that we play a primary role in, but it varies a lot by school, by teacher, by need. So one of my staff in the office, part of her primary job is to liaise and spearhead fundraising efforts with school groups. But again, this varies a lot just depending on the group, and so there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I have everything from groups that raise a good chunk of the money, they all work together, they put on a lot of events, to groups that don't do any fundraising, to individuals on their own, sort of. But that's another aspect of what we provide. All right, so my least favorite part to talk about the cost. So that $1,900, that's the same cost for all of our projects no matter where you go. That's for the 2 weeks, that's food, accommodation, insurance, pretty much everything except for international flights, in-country travel, which in this case would mean someone picking the group up at the airport in Iquitos, that first night hotel in Iquitos, which again, you guys can set up on your own, but we end up doing it for virtually all our groups. By the time you add all of that up, we're looking at probably around $3,800. All right. And the way that works, just to kind of give you guys an idea, so try to do it about a month after this presentation, but you know, being a small office, we're pretty flexible. We try to get a list of interested students. It's a $250 deposit to lock in your spot. We're holding, I think, a group of 8 right now, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're holding those for now, and then the actual breakdown is usually 3 installments. The first one being the most important because we use that to start booking flights for the group. And we try to do that as soon as possible so we can get the best deal. So for most of our groups, that's in the process now of their first big installment, which should be approximately 30% of the cost. All right, and then there's another payment December 1st, February 15th. The final balance is due April 30th or invoiced April 30th. That we adjust based on the actual cost we get for flights and in-country travel. All right, does that make sense? So that's an estimate with flights out of LAX, but we won't know the final cost until we actually book it, know the group numbers, etc. Okay, questions? Nope, good. All right, see you later.
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
The Operation
Wallacea. Yep.
Are you guys a nonprofit organization or for-profit organization?
So, sort of both. So we have a nonprofit segment called the Operation Wallacea Trust, and we're just actually in the process of starting the Wallacea Trust in the U.S. office. The organization itself is not a nonprofit. There's a couple reasons for that. It's not because we make a lot of profit. We operate basically at a 1% profit margin. Most of the money that we have goes to starting new projects. So we started 3 new ones this year. The main reason we're not set up as a nonprofit is because it gets pretty complicated if you run travel trips and want to move money between a US office and a UK office, and then to also have a nonprofit status with the IRS. Basically, just the unique structure of the organization made it pretty tough for us to register as a nonprofit. So that's why we have this separate trust. And that's what we basically right now we're trying to do is get large grants. So my boss was telling me that, the guy who started the whole organization is my boss. He's got a grant from Morgan Stanley that we need to have the nonprofit run, and we use that to actually do conservation management interventions around our sites. So the organization itself, no.
Okay. And then how big is the group for this Peru trip?
The Louisville group?
No, I mean Louisville group doesn't just.
Yeah.
It's not a separate, just Louisville group, right? You get.
No, yeah, there'd be other school groups. Yeah, so I think the maximum capacity on site is, I think it's about 50 groups. I think there's 4 other groups right now holding spots. I can check that as soon as I look on my computer. I can look at exactly what other groups are holding for that week. So, and that depends, right? Like just like Louisville, right now that's spots held. That doesn't necessarily mean final group size, but all the projects have a firm cap based on space capacity.
Like approximately how many people will be on the boat? I guess that's one.
It depends a lot on the week, but I think the week you guys are holding spots for, I think when I look today, I think there's something like 40 people total.
40 people.
Yeah.
So that's about the average size on that boat trip, right? In which Louisville will be part of.
Yeah, it's tough to give an average because what'll happen is, like, say for example, the last week or certain weeks there'll be 1 school group, and then other weeks it'll be completely full. It just depends on when other groups are coming. So it's tough to give an overall average. Like I think this year for Dominica, for example, there was 1 other group on site, right? The Walton group managed out of Georgia. So total between you guys there was about 15. The maximum capacity on that site was 32. So a lot of the weeks it was completely full at 32. I met with another group yesterday. They were the only group on site. So it really varies. But I can look in a second and tell you exactly what's being held.
How many staff though?
Oh gosh, staff. The projects are pretty heavily staffed. It ends up being about a 2-to-1 student to staff ratio on most of our projects, across all of our projects, because you've got the guides, the cooks, the medical staff, the researchers. There's a lot of moving parts involved. So yeah, they're pretty heavily staffed. But I didn't actually show it, but there's actually 4 different research ships. One of them tends to house the university volunteers. One of them is going to have mostly the school groups. The other ones are sort of depends on sometimes the research staff, sometimes the local staff. So it's kind of spread around.
So it's a group of 4 boats?
There's 4 boats total, yeah. For the Peru project, but only one of them generally has the school groups.
But 4 boats travel together?
No. So there's different times involved as well, right? So the way the project runs is that each week a group can start. And then each week a group is also going out. So they're staggered, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. So it's not like they're all traveling up and down at the same time.
Okay.
They stay on the boat the whole time? Is that?
When
you get there, you have different accommodations, or is it always the boat?
No, yeah, accommodation for overnight is on the boat. From the boat, you go out for the daytime surveys. Yep.
And then on the college credit you just mentioned, is that only good for that particular college you just mentioned?
So it would entirely depend on what other college you were looking at, how they would accept it. So it's basically, I mean, just like if you had 3 credits of any course from a U.S. university, how another U.S. university is going to, award or recognize that. I think it's going to be pretty widely accepted. It's just a matter of, like I said, it's something they just started this summer. So, or at least they had the first couple school groups sign up this summer. I'm actually going up to meet with that professor next week, so I'm going to find out a little bit more about how it transfers between schools and what she knows of college credits in the California system outside of the school system here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The little tardy, so do they fly into Lima or do they fly directly to Iquitos?
Usually, most groups are going to connect through Lima. You certainly don't have to. There are, I'm trying to remember, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but you don't have to connect through Lima. And part of that depends on what the group wants. So usually when I book flights, I work directly with the organizing chaperones and say, here's what I'm seeing. Do you guys like this flight? Do you like this option or not? Most of the time, the cheapest route is to go through Lima. Yep.
And so if they do that, then they're picked up directly from Lima to Iquitos, or do they stay the night in Lima and then go to Iquitos?
We would try really hard. I can't really think of a scenario where we would book flights where they would overnight in Lima unless they specifically wanted to, because it just gets complicated.
Right.
Leaving the hotel, another transfer, and we won't have staff on the ground in Lima, right? Our staff are based in Iquitos. It's one of the reasons that we tend to book what I was referring to as the internal travel, so that basically from point A to point B, once you're on the plane, there's someone that's going to be there to meet you, drive you to the hotel. It's a hotel we vetted. Not all groups do that. Sometimes, like I've got another school group that's looking at Peru as well. They've come out a bunch of times. She wants to take her students to Machu Picchu afterwards. That's, they don't have to do our program, but that's generally how we set it up. Yeah, so we would not want people to be on their own for a night in Lima unless they specifically wanted to.
So, like, say we did this trip, what if we as a family wanted to do Machu Picchu? Could we pick up our daughter from Lima and go off?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so give you guys just a little bit of a broader feel for how we work. I should probably be pretty candid. The U.S. office is really small, so there's 6 of us in there. So what that means is I work pretty much one-on-one with all the groups that I manage, and it gives us a lot of flexibility. So if there's a special request, if a group wants to do something and we can make it work, we will. And so I do a lot of that. I've had a lot of families do basically what you're describing, like their son or daughter will go down on our project and then they'll meet them at the end of it and they'll do a family vacation. Yeah, that's no problem. Yep.
How long have you guys been doing these surveys in Peru?
The Peru project started in 2006, I believe. I have to double check on that. I think it's 2006. It was one of our earlier projects. So like I said, we started in 1995 in Indonesia, and then it was a while before we decided to take it and make it this big global thing. So that was Honduras and Cuba were next, and those both started in 2004, and then I think Peru was like 2005 or 6. Yeah.
Just to have a sense of when they go out to do the research, is there like a lead researcher with them and like a few students along?
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly how it works. So basically, the students are broken down into small groups, usually 4 or 5. It depends a little bit on the type of survey and a little bit on the size of the group and the numbers there. Try to be around 5, and they're going to go out with whoever's leading that survey for the summer. So that researcher, and then also usually a local guide, some charismatic. It depends a little bit on the survey, and some of them are more heavily staffed than others. But yeah, they're always going out with a lead researcher.
Like, are the foods cooked like on the boat or in the jungle? Or?
Yep, on the boat. Yep. So there's food's cooked and served on the boat. Again, that's a little bit different than a lot of our projects, where you kind of have like more of a base camp setup. But the boats have been pretty thoroughly refurbished, and so they're pretty comfortable and they're pretty well set up to handle the groups. And I should mention too, if there's anyone that has like dietary preferences or restrictions, like we cater to all of that. You kind of have to these trips. Yep.
Is it traditional food that you guys serve, or?
It's going to be a mix. Breakfast is, I guess I would have to be a little bit careful because what you guys encountered at Dominica kind of surprises me. But in general, it's going to be a mix of like starches, rice, beans, pasta, some protein, chicken. They would probably do some beef, eggs. There are going to be some vegetables. There's going to be some pretty simple breakfast foods. But in the Peru project, it's not a problem for them because they have the ship to transport things. So they should have a decent variety. I mean, we have a lot of students coming out from Western countries, so it's not like we're not out there making pizzas, but at the same time, like we want people to eat. So they tend to be like hearty but fairly simple meals in my mind. I don't know.
How was the food? It's really good. Both in Dominica and Honduras is really good.
Yeah, I mean, more often than not, like I think people are expecting usually sort of the bare minimum, and at most of the sites, at least for my project, the feedback almost every year is that like the food is much better than people expect. Although in all fairness, the guy on the project, they do a really good job. They make these pretty wicked curries and they do some cool stuff down there. But yeah, they try to keep it varied and you know, healthy and nutritious. And I feel like I eat better in the summer than I do the rest of the year, to be honest. Just not because the food is like some like culinary masterpiece, but just because everything is cooked from scratch and you know, you're out walking around and you get a nice hearty meal.
So this is not a place where you'd have to worry about what I'm eating, whether I'll get sick from it or anything like that.
Nah, because I mean, with the exception of maybe when you're traveling into Iquitos, if you're going out and like, you know, out of the hotel and you're gonna go eat some street food or something like that, yeah, I mean, sure, like anywhere you travel. But on the boat, like, nah, we're bringing out all our own cooks, all our own food, and they're pretty versed in making sure everything is being handled properly and cooked properly. Like I said, if you guys want as well. As you can see by our brochure, and probably my presentation, there's a lot of moving pieces to our organization and to the expeditions. I get that. It's a lot of information. But on the website for Peru, there's a short video overview of the project, and then there's an information section, which will talk about, I mean, more than you want to know. The health and safety, but also travel advice, the kit list in terms of what we suggest you pack, the research objectives. There's a research library of publications that have come out, and then as well, for everybody that's coming, we send out a bunch of training materials, including online videos. There's a school's booklet for Peru, and that comes out usually in March or April time. So I mean, if you guys have lingering questions, you want to read more, I'm more than happy to shoot those to you or via the Canatory. Like, try to put as much out there on the table as we can to answer all your questions. So. Anything else?
Can we get a brochure?
Yeah, oh, of course. I'll say the same thing. These, a couple of these ended up in a box that got put under a doorstep, so unfortunately they got a little wet. I have to mail them to myself because they're too heavy to fly with. So I apologize for those that are a little crinkled on the edges. Anything else? Okay, well, I'll hang out for a few minutes up here. Thank you guys for coming. It's always great to have an audience, and I know everybody's busy, so I appreciate you making time to come out. Really appreciate it. All right, thank you.